Okay,
We're
thank
ready?
you.
Okay, we are ready to go now, live. I'm gonna mute myself. Mr. Chaudhary, we are ready to start.
I was waiting for you to cue me in. All right.
Sorry.
All right. All right. We could have all avoided that awkward silence. All right. Thank you guys again for coming. This is another session of our Blueprint work group on English language learners. We will continue on our journey to ensure that we can have the best possible policy conditions for our students, our multilingual learners. We all know that it's all going to converge in a final set of recommendations to our assembly. And then ultimately, that will lead to a set of decisions that will ultimately support our growing population of multilingual learners, as well as supporting their families through the educational experience that Maryland provides. So today I'm really excited. We, as every session, we have external participants that we invite. We're going to kick off today's meeting with a community engagement session. And one of the things that is really exciting to know is that there are many vested stakeholders when it comes to the success of our English language learners. And so we will have an organization that is formed specifically around ensuring that, you know, our policy conditions can be the absolute best. And Dr. Collins will introduce them, and we will have a session with them. And then with that, we're going to move on to school finance. And so our guiding question today is around what policy conditions, what funding policy conditions enable and both support an equitable education for English language learners and their families in Maryland. So that is going to be our guiding question. And then just like every one of our work sessions, we will look at national best practices. We will look at what existing policies exist in Maryland and what gaps exist between the national best practices and Maryland's practices. And then we will end with a work group time to begin to process what you learned today. So with that, I'll shift over to Dr. Collins, and I'm just going to listen and learn today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Frank Patinella. Ilhe, you can go to the next slide. This is great. Perfect. Thank you. Frank is the Senior Education Advocate at the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU of Maryland. And also he'll introduce the members of the Community Workgroup on English Language Learners, Community Well. Just a little bit about Mr. Patinella. He works with community groups, parents, and other advocates to keep them informed of education policy matters and organizing efforts. He's also focused on working with grassroots communities to develop new education policies and to take a look at funding formulas to make sure they're adequate for students. So thank you so much, Frank and Community Well, for joining us today. I will help facilitate. I'm going to give Mr. Patel a little bit of time to talk a little bit about Community Well and who they are and introduce members. And then we'll just facilitate in engaging conversation around EL funding. So Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chaudhary, members of the work group and MSDE staff. Thank you for inviting us here to speak with you today. We only have 30 minutes, so I'll spend just a couple minutes introducing our group and leave the bulk of the time for the panel discussion. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, I'm with the ACLU of Maryland, have been for 14 years. I'm also the son of immigrants, so this issue is very near and dear to my heart. Our group came together. Sorry, I might be going out of order of the slides. Our group came together in the fall of last year after we learned that this group, the Blueprint Work Group on English Language Learners, started meeting. We asked for the meetings to be streamed and that information be accessible, and we asked to be partners in the work. MSDE responded quickly, and we are encouraged. We met with MSDE staff in January and had several members of our group participate in an MSDE listening session for English language learners and special education, and now we're here. We're also working on a large public town hall or listening session with students, parents, and teachers and school staff on either June 1st or the 2nd. We hope that Mr. Chowdhury, MSDE staff, and members of this work group will be our special guests and help us co-facilitate the small group listening sessions. We are in communication with MSDE staff, so details to come very soon. So right now we have about 30 people in our coalition, including staff from including members of the community, parents, and student advocates, ESOL teachers from various counties, policy experts, and community and advocacy groups. And you can see on the slide here our members, and I think we've added some since we sent this list. Next slide, please. Oh, that's going to be you. I guess we can go up. I think these are your questions. Our main goal was to ensure that the recommendations of this work group's in the work group's final report in December are comprehensive, inclusive, and transformative for immigrant students and families throughout the state. We are in a special moment now. We are at the beginning of this nearly $4 billion investment in education via the blueprint. And now's the time to overhaul the policies and practices that dictate what happens in the classrooms, right? In the hallways, on school grounds, in parent-teacher conferences, at IEP meetings, and more. I want to see this kind of authentic engagement throughout the work group's process. Lastly, it's important to note that doing authentic engagement is very challenging. Most of the members of our work group are spending their days teaching in public schools or at the college level or running their own programs. And many of us are parents as well. So their time is very limited, and further, they may not respond to just one email or a call. It takes a lot of time and flexibility to pull them into the work, and it requires relationship building. But it's absolutely necessary, and if we're all interested in moving forward together, we are certainly committed to helping you make these connections. So thanks again, and let's jump into it.
Thank you, Frank. That was great. Great introduction. So as you know, today we're talking about funding policy. So our first question for the panel is, what do you see as the priorities for EL funding?
Well, should I jump in?
Go for it, Eva.
Hi, my name is Eva Sullivan. I'm an ESOL teacher at Richard Montgomery High School in Rockville, Maryland, Montgomery County Public Schools. One of the things at the top of our list is college and career readiness. And since I teach mostly high school, all high school, I wanted to talk about a couple of things that are at the top of my mind. One of them is vocational technical school training. We have a lot of students here at my school who go half-time to a technical college. We also have something called the CREA model for older students who cannot, who age 18 and over, who come to this country and have little chance of graduating and getting the right credits before age 21. And this is a program that gives them certificates in a trade and allows them to get certificates. Even though they don't get a high school diploma, they get a GED. And I was hoping we could advocate for more funding with these types of programs for high school students. I'm going to pass it on to one of our next priorities, and Dr. Woodson. Thank you.
Hello, I just want to go back a quick step, if I could, in direct response to Dr. Collins' questions in terms of which areas of study and policies that we feel should be prioritized for funding. And so there are 3 of them, I believe. The first is that we are asking for the work group to broaden your focus to include older, neurodiverse, newcomers, gifted students, and LGBTQIA+, I hope I have it right, students. Secondly, the second policy area our recommendations fall into would be around the need to spend time on developing new policies to address the ESOL and multilingual educator shortage. We want to make sure that policies really, target attracting and retaining educators that understand what it takes to build that positive school environment to reduce barriers that often immigrants encounter, and just students in general. Thirdly, we want to, the third policy area for us is around the need to create perhaps standards that are based on strategic objectives to assess a district's overall environment, including intercultural communication, competence, and anti-racist and equitable practices. I'm going to delve just a little bit into that first policy area, if I may, which was to broaden the focus to include older, neurodiverse, newcomer, and LGBTQ plus students. Let me give you a little detail around this work group's focus in this area. We applaud the ELL Blueprint work group at MSDE for its focus on dual language learners in the early grades and also dual language models. That is awesome. That's where we need to be at this point. It is refreshing to see that. But we have to also remember to address challenges amongst the older ELL population. And Eva was just speaking about that. We want to make sure that while we are focusing in on ramping up dual language programs, you know, from a budgetary point of view, it's going to be a lot of FTEs involved in that, a lot of training that would have to come along with that. So that's certainly something that will be of tremendous budgetary impact. Now, there's one area that we really felt strongly on in this, and that was around those students who don't meet the college and career readiness standards by the end of grade 10. We're just doing a little reading in the blueprint, and we understand that the goal is to make sure that all students meet college and career readiness requirements by the end of grade 10 so that they may pursue a pathway that would get them to their next, be it, you know, a college or a career pathway and so on. However, we are a little concerned about the predictability of the data. So for example, we can see when you look at the students who may not be meeting college and career readiness standards by the end of grade 10, given what we know about disproportionality, given what we know about achievement gaps, it's highly likely that the students that we're serving may sort of end up not being able to meet that particular requirement. And so we really want to get ahead of that. And we want to be able to have a plan for, you know, what we anticipate. Hopefully we're wrong, but achievement data and trends in the past will sort of give us a concern here to make sure that we're ready to respond when we have an overrepresentation of ELs or former ELs end up not meeting college and career readiness standards. Again, the good news is if the state is really fully committed to dual language and implementing it pre-K all the way up to grade 12, that, in my opinion, in my professional opinion, is a tremendous way to address that anticipated gap, because we know the research says your dual language learners over time will outperform your monolingual English speaking peers. We know this. So let us at the beginning think about the funding part and think about what is it going to take to get us to do dual language all the way through so that we can actually get the results that is so well known in the research. My final point is that we definitely want to break this pattern. Again, you know, many of the educators at the table may understand, you know, I know you understand what I mean when I talk about predictability of the data. You kind of know which students end up in which areas of need. We got to break this pattern, and we can do that with more supports, improved programming, tailored to the various populations. Now, Eva, I'm going to pitch this back over to you, but I believe you were talking about already the older students with the newcomer, immigrant, and so on. So I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to say about that, Eva.
I did. Thank you. Through my high school lens, I see a huge need for social emotional support for students and families, especially after, you know, 2 years of pandemic learning. I feel there's so many opportunities that we could seize on. We need more bilingual staff, not just teachers, but we could use bilingual staff in the classroom as paraeducators, classroom aides, and especially bilingual counselors. In my district, we have one bilingual counselor who's part-time. She's here 2 days a week. There are 2,500 school students at this school and about 200 ESOL students. If we could get more bilingual counselors into our schools, this would be a huge, huge help. Parent community coordinators who speak the language of our community would be awesome. All this requires additional staff. I had another idea about, with Governor Hogan's recent announcement about getting rid of the requirement for government workers or state workers to have a college degree. I thought, why not tap into some of our recent graduates and offer a pathway for them to come back as classroom aides? They're part of our community. They speak the languages of our community. And maybe there could be some role for recent graduates who speak all the languages that we find in our schools. And we could actually, bring them into the fold. So that was one of the ideas I had, definitely supporting social emotional issues with our students. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Owen, who has a different take in his role as community college teacher.
Thank you, Eva. So my name is Owen Silverman Andrews, and I'm the instructional specialist for English language learning at Anne Arundel Community College. I'm going to share a link to some data in the chat, and I think the framework through which the community work group on English language learning is working is through both data-informed approach and also an approach of the experience of our members, our coalition members, as classroom teachers, directly affected folks in the community, and practitioners. I'll be speaking to one of the groups that Dr. Woodson mentioned, and that's older multilingual learners, and specifically to the policy of dual enrollment of high school students in community colleges. And the data I shared from the Community College Research Center at Columbia University shows that Maryland has some work to do when it comes to matching or hopefully surpassing some of our peer states, which have large multilingual high school populations. We know that dual enrollment in community college is a great option for high school students to gain college credit. There was a really exciting Twitter thread recently with a lot of high school students and practitioners talking about AP versus dual enrollment and how dual enrollment is superior in lots of ways, not for every student, but for many students. But what we see in the data is that for several reasons, multilingual students identified as ESOL students are systematically not being included in dual enrollment programs through partnerships between high schools and community colleges. So to go back to that question of priorities related to EL funding, I think we need to make sure that those classes are accessible from a funding model. Tuition, there's some tuition available, tuition savings available for high school students, but making sure that tuition is never an obstacle for dual enrollment, just like it wouldn't be for AP. Well, if dual enrollment is a better option for students, then we need to work with our partners in the General Assembly and Annapolis in general, and get community colleges and district stakeholders at the table to figure out how to remove tuition barriers. The second option is providing more professional development so that every ESOL teacher in middle school and high school, every guidance counselor knows that this is a program that includes multilingual students as well. This isn't just a program for students who are in advanced coursework or who are, of course, not just for students who are English L1. This is for all students, and multilingual students identified as ESOL students can benefit very much from dual enrollment. So I think those are addressing tuition and making sure that all ESOL teachers and guidance counselors and on the community college parents as well are receiving accurate and timely information about this opportunity. So tuition and outreach. And I think dual enrollment is a great opportunity. Expanding that in Maryland will really be beneficial for our high school students and our college students, because that gap, that line is blurring as we move into the middle decades of the 21st century, and we need to blur it even more and make sure we're looking at a pre-K through 14 model. So thanks. I'll pass it back. I think Gabriela or Dr. Lemus are you next? Mm-hmm.
Can't hear you. You have to unmute.
I was just about to say that. Okay, thank you so much. So I'll be very brief. I'd like to kind of go back to what Eva was saying related to the social emotional issues. I'm with Maryland Latinos Unidos, and we have been doing a lot of healthcare work related to the pandemic, but also health equity more generally, and social determinants of health and education and ELL, et cetera, both children and adults. And for us, part of what we also need to, we believe, needs to be ensured is that as the process evolves and we begin to build out these centers for health, that also within the schools, excuse me, that like when we're hiring behavioral health service coordinators, that we consider ensuring that these are also bilingual staff, that the role they play is very important. U.S. Surgeon General just released a report like a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, basically saying that suicide amongst 11 to 25-year-olds is growing exponentially, and particularly in immigrant communities, and African American students as well. But this is a real challenge, and you know, these students have really been facing so many things through the pandemic, including a number of issues at home. We're also seeing, sadly, increase in domestic violence. So making sure that there's staff available, and I understand that, you know, whenever you read these health equity reports, they're saying there's not a sufficient bilingual staff, but there is large groups of community health workers that have been trained and are being trained that could potentially play a really important role in this. They're connected to the community, they understand the community members, they're of the community. And so it's a possibility of sort of a way to begin to address social determinants of health in a way that each agency can play a positive role, and bring that to the table. I see that as part of EL funding because these students are very much the ones that are being affected. The other point was around wraparound services. I myself, I joke that I have been the product of every single language acquisition project you can think of. I lived as a child, I had the opportunity, I'm very privileged, I've lived all over, but my parents always sent me to local schools. So I was continuously having to either learn, you know, like 3 languages at once, or et cetera, et cetera. And these wraparound services are so important for these students. That has to be part of it as well, because as good as your professors are with content and with you know, language, there's always a need for extra support, especially for these kids who may not have so much support at home and whose family members themselves may not speak English fluently. I will
Dr.
I guess.
Lemus, so before you transition to someone else, I want to get
Sure.
into our next question because you took us there a little bit. So
Okay.
if the group can begin to add to what you're saying, like how can EL funding support community and family engagement? You mentioned the word community, but you also talked around wraparound support. So if someone else in the group can, you know, add to what you're saying, how can
Absolutely.
funding be really used to support the community and family engagement?
Well, I guess I can hand it over to Denora. This is really, and Susanna, this is really their area of expertise.
Unmute.
Uh,
Unmute. Yeah.
Denora, or okay, I'll take it. Well, so
There you
Okay,
are.
I'm sorry. Yes, my name is Dinora Olmos, and I am the president and CEO for the Latino Education Advancement Fund. And as you can imagine, it is our most important aspect is to improve communication from parents, students, and family members. You know, right now the communication, both written and verbal, it's so bad, completely lacking in most of the state. We hear, in my case, I'm talking about what I hear constantly, and it's services for English learners, students, but there is a critical component missing, and that is educating parents on the U.S. school system. You know, we completely forget about the family, the rest of the triangle. We have the school, the student, and what happened with the family. Parent education and engagement is crucial for student achievement, even more for first generation English learners, parents, and students.
EL parents need more than just translated documents or invitations to multicultural potlucks. They need to understand how to navigate the school system. They need to engage. They need to feel welcome, appreciated, understood. They need to participate in the ways teachers expect, such as supervising homework or attending back to school nights or parent teacher conferences. They really need also emails in their own language, letters, online information. There's so much. Understanding the school grade, parents' rights and responsibilities in their language, school attendance. I want to make sure that we can ensure that parents, students, and families are informed and educated about how the school system works. And most important, to be informed in a timely manner, not when everything is done and then you start finding out, oh yeah, but that happened 2 months ago. No, we really need to do that, especially for example when you run into situations like a special education. And I'm going to let Susana talk a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you. Well, let me just backtrack a little bit with and add something to what Dinora said. I think that we need to make sure that it's clearly written, not just in a known fact, but it's not written anywhere, how to request an interpreter, and for events, not just for schools, but for district-wide or anything that parents have a right to an interpreter. And then I know that sometimes you need 5 days, but you need to inform parents early on so that they know how to request it. So that it's addition to the education. And with special education, I think that there's a lot of parents don't understand what's going on. They go to meetings, they are given huge documents in a language that they don't understand. So not only do they not understand the process, but the information is given to them in in a different language. So I think that there needs to be more funding provided for translating of documents, especially IEP documents. We need more bilingual staff. And I also want to highlight that a lot of times when we say bilingual, people think, oh, Spanish speaking only. And we need to remember that we have a lot of people that speak other languages, especially right now. We have people from Afghanistan. We're going to have people from Ukraine. We have people from China. So I also want to bring back that when we need translation services, it cannot just be one language. It needs to be several languages. They need to have access to staff that is available, that can have can contact the parents. And also, if it's not available, then schools need to have the funding to use interpretation services via phone or via video chat, which is now available. There's different apps that are available. And so I think that those are the things, but keeping the parents informed in their native language, right? So not just because we just say bilingual staff, we're only addressing one language. And I think that the key word here is native language to parents. And also providing children. There's a lot of children that failed the ESOL test, but it's not because they don't understand English. It's because they failed the test because they might have a learning disability. So I would also like some funding to be provided for evaluations in different languages other than just English or just Spanish, so that we can rule out they're failing the test because they might have a disability, or is it because they don't understand the language. So that would be
Right.
something else that I would like to add. And I don't know, are we going back to the first question, or are we going back so I would know who to throw it
I
to?
just want to add to what the question was, and I just want to say that thank you for this opportunity to present to you today. And we want to make sure that this is the normal way of working with all the community. And it is very important that we can see also a school administration officials, a school level staff that really represent what USA is nowadays. And so we need additional staff, parent community coordinators. You know, as a Latina, I feel good when I could go and take a class and I see another Latina talking or teaching. And you know, I would like to see more brown and black teachers and staff and administrators and many other cultures. But we need to represent what United States looks like. And at this moment, at schools, we don't. And so I really would like to see that. And of course, we cannot forget about we need the staff and administrators to be culturally competent because they need to understand better the stories behind the faces.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And that dovetails into the last question that we have. We're curious to know how can MSDE and local school systems enhance transparency and collaboration? You all talked right now about, being transparent. When we think about funding decisions, right? How can we enhance collaboration and transparency? And we'd also like to know, have you seen any good examples of this at the school of the district level that could help us?
I can start with this one. When the Kirwan Commission developed the funding formula that is now adopted into law, and there has been a couple amendments to what was initially proposed, that work was not done in public. It was behind closed doors. So, I've been looking at a lot of the documents that came out from the Kirwan Commission, and I'm having a hard time finding out what is the rationale, what are the assumptions that were used to develop the funding formula. We know that the foundation per pupil increases, which, and we understand that that is for a lot of just the core programmatic things for schools, the basic staffing, teacher to student ratio, counselors, things and staff that all schools need. But then there are the weighted categories, right? And we know that ELL goes from 0.99 multiplier against the per pupil down to, I think it's a 0.87. And we don't understand why that happened. So enhancing transparency, I would like to recommend that there be a session on that specifically. How was the blueprint formula developed? What are the assumptions? What does this formula pay for? And I hope that there are opportunities to critique the formula because, as you heard from people on this in this session, there are a lot of needs, and a lot of the needs, whether it has to do with college and career readiness, dual enrollment, dual language schools, bilingual counselors, engagement, all of these things require additional funding, and it is unclear whether or not this new formula plus the English language learner weight will accomplish these things. So under a process by which we can see, what are the cost estimations of staffing that's included in the blueprint formula, right? And is it adequate? Is it going to provide the adequate staffing levels and services and resources at the school level? So that's kind of like the higher end or the broad view. At the school level, what I hear a lot, especially from people in Baltimore City, is that there is engagement with the community around budget decisions, but there's very, very little discretionary money that the principals have to work with. So the community comes and they have a lot of ideas, and the principal's like, that's great, but I really need to hire my core teachers first, and then there's just a little bit left over, and really not enough to really address the needs that are being voiced by the school community.
That's right.
So anyone else want to weigh in on this question?
Sorry, I just think that providing the information in several languages is important because you're trying to be transparent, but sometimes the information is only going out in English. So it's important that we remember that in order to have meaningful input from different parents, you need to send out the information in their native language.
I would add that, part of transparency isn't just in the funding process, it's also in the hiring process. And how are these folks being selected per school, et cetera? I realize it's a lot of schools and there's levels of independence and centrality, and you have to do all that figuring out. But when you're the person on the ground and you're really interested and maybe you want to be that coordinator for the community center or for whatever position, oftentimes our communities get left out. I represent Latinos. I know it's really hard to connect the dots sometimes, and that requires more than just blasting out an email through Idealist. It really does take part of that community engagement work has to include the like, we're hiring, we're getting ready to do this, and that's also really important, because then the community feels included, and oh well, we know these, there's people here who know us, right, and who are going to work with us.
I did speak to a couple of the AIB, Blueprint AIB members, and one thing that I've heard a lot about requests from people in schools, whether that be parent or students, is that they know this big blueprint bill passed. They know $3.8 million is in the pipeline. It's going to be phased in over 10 years. And we asked the AIB to make sure that as the money phases in, people at the school level know what to expect, right, with that funding, because there's a certain amount of funding that's coming through the different categorical line items, such as the concentration of poverty grant, right? So some schools now have the personnel grant for the concentration of poverty, and then they're starting to receive the per pupil dollars associated with that to implement a community school strategy. So but no one really knows that except people who really look at all these, budget documents and, Department of Legislative Services analyses. So making that information readable, right, and digestible for people at the school level is important.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank, and members of Community Well. This is a great, authentic, and engaging discussion. We appreciate all of the ideas that you all shared around funding. Unfortunately, we do have to transition to another portion of our meeting, but to be continued, right? Lots of great ideas around staffing, around narrowing a specific focus around student groups, community support, and family engagement. We know that you all have other things that you're doing, so we really appreciate your time for joining us. We've also dropped in the chat the streaming link, because we are streaming live. So as you transition out, feel free to jump on the link to join the live stream so you can continue to hear the meeting. But again, we all thank you. I don't want to speak for Mr. Chaudhary because he can speak, but I know he thanks you as well. I'm going to transition to him for some closing remarks as he transitions us to the next part of our meeting. But once again, Frank and members of Community Well, we really appreciate your time today and your ideas, and we look forward to working with you. And please click on the link to join the so you can continue watching the live stream. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Chaudhary.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
And we look forward to that event, hopefully in the summer. And I will definitely be there. If my team didn't tell you already, it was my idea to do that event with you guys. So we are going to do it. So I will be there. So I'll see you guys at that event, and I'll see you at many other things that we do together. So thank you guys for your time. I really appreciate it. So
Thank you.
all right. With that, we're going to shift over to our next presenter. I'm excited to introduce Zahra, who's here with us from the Education Trust, as well as Justin Dayhoff, who is my school finance resident nerd when it comes to everything school finance. And they are going to essentially be doing a tag team on a presentation. Zahra will bring the national perspective on funding and when it comes to our multilingual learners, and Justin will bring scope that into what it looks like for Maryland and what and its implications, and all of that will ultimately shift to a fun exercise that we built for you. So you got to really pay attention to with school finance. It's one of those things that doesn't always come naturally to people. It doesn't come naturally to me. So it takes me time to, make sure I'm breaking it apart. And so Justin knows I ask him many, many questions. So with that, I'm really excited. And today, we're really honored to have Zahra as well. She is school finance she was actually, when we revamped our Texas system, she was an expert person who was brought in by the Texas legislator to also testify on what to think about and such. So with that, I will shift over to them.
Thank you so much, Superintendent, and certainly very excited to engage in this conversation and to get to do so with Zahra. So Zahra, I know we just had an introduction, but if you'd like to say hi, wave, introduce yourself, and we'll get rolling from there.
Well, hi, everyone. You already heard my name and a little bit about what I do. I'll just say the reason that hopefully I can bring something to the table for this conversation specifically is that my core focus is on state level education funding policy. I'm really the formula person on our team, and especially when it comes to cross-state comparisons. So understanding who else is doing something that might be worth borrowing, who else can you be teaching, and what kind of best practices can we beg, borrow, and steal from around the country?
Awesome. And I probably don't have any more to add because I am indeed a school finance nerd, and I embrace that, and I'm glad that I get to bring that to this conversation today. So with that being said, we'll dive right on in.
Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do is give you a little bit of background on what a school funding formula is and how we determine what state formula aid comes to a district. So first, there are a few steps to this slide. So number one is there is a formula that states use to determine how much money each district needs for the year. There's a target set for each district for the year based on lots of different factors, and this is the thing we'll really come back to. But that's step one. Then in step two, there is an expected local contribution. The state figures out how much it is reasonable based on usually local property values. In Maryland, also the question of local income levels, how much it's reasonable to expect the district to kick in from local sources. And that will cover a portion of the district's target amount for the year. And then step three is the balance that comes in as state formula aid. So there is a target set for every district, but the entire target doesn't get paid for by the state. So in this particular case, this district has a target of about 17 million. Obviously, this is a smaller district than some Maryland districts. So the district has a target of 17 million, but it's expected to cover about 7 million of that out of local funds because of its local wealth levels. That's what's considered to be a reasonable contribution. So the state will provide the other 10 to this district. So next slide. So the question really in terms of step one is, what are our policy levers for getting the right formula amount? What kind of questions are we trying to answer? What policy considerations go into the legislative process and any kind of advocacy and rulemaking that informs that process? So how much funding do we need per student? How should the funding system account for all kinds of specific needs that students may have? And also not just at the student level, but also at the district and community level. Things like, does the district experience a concentration of poverty rather than just a sprinkling of students with individual economic needs? Is it a sparse district that may have transportation challenges? What are labor market differences that might affect hiring? Things like that. And so one more click here gets us to, obviously, the thing that we are focused on today is how the funding system should specifically account for the needs of English learners. So in terms of a really basic picture of what it means that Maryland has what's called a weighted student funding formula. That means, and this is true in many states around the country, that the formula begins with a base amount of funding per pupil. That's on the left side of the slide. And that amount is then increased or inflated using weights or percentage multipliers for students in particular need categories. So as you can see, this year, we have a base of $7,390 per student in Maryland, and that is the starting point of setting the district's target amount. That's not the total per pupil funding, that's the first step in the math. Then this year, English learners have a 100% funding boost, or a 2.0 weight. 2.0 times the base is an extra 100%, an extra one. So you add on an extra $7,390 this year for a total per EL funding this year of close to $15,000. Okay, but the blueprint bill is phasing in over time. And so by fiscal year 33, so over the course of this 11-year phase-in, we're going to have a significantly higher base, but as you can see, a reduction in the weight. So 100% of the base amount, plus then only 85% of that base amount going forward. So the dollar amount is higher, but the percentage is lower. So what you wind up with by fiscal year 2033 is close to $23,000 in total base plus supplemental funding per English learner. So just another way of thinking about this is, where are the blueprint monies getting invested? If you have a student without identified needs, a student who is funded at the base level, to whom no weights apply, they're not in a weighted category, they're not an English learner, they're not a student from a low-income background, they're not a student with a disability, they're a student without identified needs, so they get funded at the base level. Their funding is going up from $7,390 to $12,365, which over the course of that 11-year period is a 67% increase as the blueprint money phases in. An English learner, because the weight is getting reduced over time from an 100% boost this year to an 85% boost over and above the base in fiscal year 33, their money over time is getting increased by 55%. So what we see is that while the English learner student is ultimately still funded at a higher level, that the investment being made by the blueprint is not as great in an English learner student proportionally as it is in a student without identified needs, just in terms of how we divide the blueprint pie.
And so with that, it's helpful, I think, to then couch us directly in some of the language of the law to talk about what the law defines as an English learner and to lay out a little bit more deeply for FY23, our upcoming fiscal year specifically, what the funding looks like for English learners in the more immediate future. So as Zahra said, the blueprint provides for per pupil funding allocations or weights for students who are English learners. The way that the law defines them specifically uses the term limited English proficiency, where that is measured by the reporting requirements associated with the MCAP. So students who qualify for this weight are identified through the MCAP, at which point, to Zahra's comments, the weight is applied to those students. So each year, we collect the data, we report out to the Department of Budget Management and Department of Legislative Services the number of students who qualify for that weight, and the actual calculation comes from applying those per pupil amounts to those students. So we take that weight and multiply it times the number of students who are eligible. Just as the definition of English learner is defined in law in section 5224, so too are those weights that Zahra mentioned. And so those phase-in amounts are stipulated each year specifically in the law. And so again, in FY23, so we just looked at FY22, in FY23, the weight is again that 100%, so that 2.0 essentially. So in FY33 and beyond, as we talked about earlier, that goes down to 85%. So just for some additional context for our FY23 budget, that 7390 is now 8,310 per pupil. So the FY23 amount for English learners will be 8,310 per pupil. How the English learner formula, though, situates within the broader context of the blueprint formula is also, I think, an instructive way to look at this, because as Zahra mentioned earlier, the blueprint's investments in different subgroups are different. And this lays out currently in the FY23 formula, at least, where per pupil in state share of state aid, those investments lie. And as you can see, because the English learners is at 100% again here in FY23, it matches the foundation program. And so on the screen here, the bottom dark blue color, that's the foundation amount per pupil. The top color here is the English learner amount per pupil. The English learner amount is essentially the third highest weight in the formula currently when we look at it per pupil. Although worth noting here that there are subgroups of aid that are not implemented at the per pupil level. And so some of these are calculated using the number of students who ultimately qualify it, but some of those are block grant amounts, like, for example, transportation, which is why you see that up there so high. So just to note here, as far as contextually speaking goes, the 4,208 in state share of state aid, which is half of that, 8,300, constitutes a small portion of a larger piece of the funding formula pie at the per pupil level. However, while that looks the same here in terms of per pupil cost as the foundation amount, when we look at this in terms of per pupil dollars, we know that the number of students who qualify for English learner weight is smaller than the number of students who qualify for the foundation for that base amount. And so taking us back a step further, this is now looking across total state aid, so gross dollars, how these formula amounts differ. And so as you can see here again at the bottom, our foundation program, the state share, is nearly $3.7 billion. In contrast, the state share of English learner funding in FY23 is about $422 million. Certainly more investment than has been made previously, but it's important to situate the English learner funding amidst the broader amounts of resources that students will receive as part of the different major aid categories of the blueprint law. Note here, we'll talk about this a little more deeply right now as we start thinking about policy considerations, and Community Well raised some of this issue earlier as well. English learner funding in the blueprint reflects a single weight for eligible English learners, right? So any English learner, regardless of that assessment, that qualifying criteria or other needs, receives in the blueprint formula that same in FY23, that same 8,310, right? And so that is not necessarily the only policy option when it comes to deploying and determining resources to support English learners. And so Zahra is going to talk us through what other policy considerations exist when it comes to thinking through nuanced approaches to English learner weights.
Thanks. So one reason that I'm here speaking to you today is that I can share with you a report that exists called Common Sense and Fairness, and its associated web tool. And the purpose of this tool is, Justin and I just told you what Maryland is doing now, but we did not tell you what is the best way to do it. And whenever I talk to people in states, and I say, well, you've got a problem here, you've got a problem there. And they say, okay, well, who's doing it right that we can copy? And the answer is no one is doing it right across the board, but every area of funding policy has somebody doing it right. And so the purpose of this report is to stitch together best practices across formula elements from all states across the country to say, okay, if we can borrow this state's English learner policy, that state's policy for funding students with disabilities, this state's policy of dealing with sparse and rural districts, et cetera, you can come up with the best practice formula across the board. So, and this report was co-developed by EdBuild, which is an organization focused on school funding policy and equity in partnership with the Education Trust and Education Resource Strategies. So here are the policy components addressed in the Common Sense and Fairness report. And so we're trying to cover a whole lot. And of course, today, what we're going to be talking about is the specific recommendations in the report for supporting English learners. Generally speaking, the recommendations in the report are provided in tiers because different states have different conditions. They have different status quo policies, different needs. They may not be able to be equally ambitious in every area of policy. So usually we offer these 3 tiers. Silver is sort of the baseline of good policy and usually has many precedents around the country, but there are still a lot of states that could shoot for silver and see strong improvement. Gold is a stronger, more ambitious policy. We still see 1 or 2 precedents around the country, but it is not standard practice. And we also tend to offer a moonshot recommendation that offers a path for states looking to break new ground in order to push really further towards a policy ideal. So what I'm going to do here is march through the 3 recommendations we have for English learner funding, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we can grade Maryland against these recommendations. The silver recommendation is pretty simple, that within a weighted student funding formula, there should be a generous weight applied to the base amount for every English learner. And by doing this through a weight, as opposed to through legislated money for this purpose and that purpose, we have a substantial amount of supplemental flexible funding to support the district's decision-making for its unique student population, whatever that looks like for that district, appropriate instruction, obtaining materials, development for staff, hiring, providing training. We heard a lot earlier about translation services, about family engagement. So providing flexible weighted funding so that the district can tailor its use of the dollars to the community on the ground. But the key thing here is the weight needs to be generous. We need a substantial amount of money. So by national standards, actually, Maryland is doing quite well on the silver score. The weight is at or approaching research recommended levels. So research generally recommends doubling your base amount for students from students who are learning English. So what we have here is it's meeting that recommendation right now. It will be almost meeting that recommendation going forward. And frankly, despite the reduction to 85%, I will tell you, sadly, this may be sadly, but 85% is better than almost anybody's doing. Maryland has the 2nd highest weight in the country for English learners. And so even though we might want to see a yet more robust weight, in terms of how to grade Maryland against this silver recommendation, I would say Maryland is meeting this bar right now. Gold gets to a different level. So what we see here is that generous weights should be applied to the base amount, not just a single weight, but in what we're recommending here is 3 tiers. So greater levels of funding provided for students with lower levels of current English proficiency. So that is one thing where this approach allows the state to provide different levels of resources for English learners with different needs. And this is not an unprecedented practice. It's not super common, but we see this in Michigan, Indiana, Hawaii, North Dakota, Iowa. There's plenty of precedent around the country to look at differentiated models. The other gold recommendation is that the state should have a way to account for the fact that there's a challenge when you have a small number of English learners enrolled in your district. So on a per pupil basis, it may be more expensive to effectively serve a couple of students with English learning needs or a small number than when you can have a full classroom that's dual language, for instance, or when your staff can go from school to school serving higher numbers of English learners, that you still need to effectively and robustly serve those English learners, even if there aren't very many of them in your district, and there are diseconomies of scale there. And so there should be a way of dealing with that. So different ways that states do this, for instance, Minnesota sets a minimum EL count for districts. So if you have any ELs, we give you a minimum count for funding purposes of 20. So we'll fund at least 20 students in Minnesota. And Minnesota has many smaller districts than Maryland, just for reference for the numbers. Another way to do this is to increase the EL weight for districts serving few EL students. So in Maine, the EL weight is generally 50%, but it's 70% if you have 15 or fewer English learners. Things like that, where you can differentiate the funding to account for those challenges of serving fewer students effectively. So differentiation in terms of student proficiency, differentiation in terms of the number of English learners served in the district. How does Maryland do here? not so great. So there's no current differentiation by proficiency level. As Justin was saying earlier, there is a single flat weight across the board. There is no adjustment depending on the number of English learners served in the district. What we do have is the data that would enable us to do this. So there is data collected at the state level in Maryland on both student proficiency levels within the English learner population and also the size of the EL enrollment by district, but the proficiency data is not publicly reported. So we could begin to do that at the department level for the purposes of transparency and to begin building the case that there are different needs in different districts, laying the groundwork potentially for a future policy that explicitly recognizes these things in funding levels. So the moonshot recommendation takes what was in gold and expands it. So you may have seen earlier that the description of moonshot recommendations are more targeted and precise, but also more complex. So that's your trade-off when you're shooting for the moon. But the moonshot recommendation is that generous weights should be applied in tiers based on two things. One, students' levels of current English language proficiency, as we discussed earlier, and two, the prevalence of their native language in the district. We talked about this economies of scale. If you have a district where nearly all English learners speak a single language as their native language, then there is an economy of scale in providing programming for that population. You can establish dual language programs. It is easier to hire staff, things of that nature. Whereas if you have, for instance, a very linguistically diverse population in a district, if you've done a lot of refugee resettlement, you may have a district that serves students with 35 different native languages. You're not going to address that with one single dual language school. And so that kind of diseconomy of scale is something that you also want to address, in addition to what I was talking about before with the dichotomies of scale associated with serving a small number overall of English learners. And the last thing in the moonshot recommendation regards students with limited and interrupted formal education, or SLIFE. And the point here is that I don't even have a recommendation to provide designated funding for the student population because we don't have the data that we would need in almost any state. This is not a Maryland specific problem. This is why that generally this is a moonshot recommendation, to lay the data groundwork to identify these students and count them effectively so that we can lay the groundwork to fund them in a targeted way. So how does Maryland do against these moonshot recommendations? We know there's no current differentiation by proficiency level. We know there's no adjustment based on the number of English learners served. There's also no differentiation depending on the prevalence of a student's native language in the district. We do have that data on proficiency level and linguistic diversity. So the state does know which native languages students speak in different districts, but they do not report that number publicly. So again, that's something that we may want to consider as a group. And of course, going back to that SLIFE issue, as in many states, Maryland shares a challenge that the classification of students as having limited and interrupted formal education is based on intake surveys that are done when a student enrolls. They are not uniform across all districts. There's not a very clear and easily applicable definition in every district, and there's not a strong process that follows that student throughout to see whether that classification remains appropriate. So this is the kind of thing where there is potential groundwork to be laid for meeting this recommendation bar. So just the key takeaways of these recommendations: differentiation, differentiation, differentiation. Right now we have a, by national standards, generous but otherwise flat amount of supplemental funding for every English learner. And so there is perhaps a higher priority in terms of targeting the funds than a simple blunt force increase to the weight. That the kind of thing where you might be thinking about a sliding scale instead of an 85% weight, maybe a sliding scale from 70 to 110. We may be looking at something where an individual district should have a minimum EL count for the purposes of funding its programs, where we might be tracking linguistic diversity and thinking about the costs of those programs. So, and of course, the student's educational history, is it limited and or interrupted? What does that mean for students in Maryland? How do we follow those students? So there's work being done in one place or another on all of these issues. Maryland is operating, I think, from a position of strength in that the state is already meeting the silver bar, and there is yet more to be gained by thinking about this kind of targeting of funding.
And the other side of the funding coin is not just how much funding comes through the formula, but also how well are those funds used? Where are those funds used, and in what way are those funds used? And so the next part of this conversation is talking through the other aspect of the blueprint formula, specifically as it relates here to English learners and broadly to other areas of major aid category. But the blueprint for legislation does put in place these weights, right, for English learners. It goes further, though, because in previous iterations of the formula, so we think about the Bridge to Excellence, the Thornton formula, when the state allocated most of its state share, with some exception, most of the state share to local education agencies, to the school districts, once those funds hit the school district's doors, they become part of the overall district revenue, their overall allocation, from which they can then plan how they're going to deploy those funds to the different schools, to fixed costs and central office, et cetera. Well, the blueprint wants to, the law at least, is designed to ensure that funds that are associated with these different student groups, these student subgroups, go to the schools in order to more directly serve the children for whom these weights are designed. The way that the law does this is through another section of the law. It's Title V, Section 234 of the article. And for English learners specifically, it requires that at least 75% of the per pupil amount applicable to English language learner education program under 5224, which we talked about earlier, that stipulates the actual formula itself, multiplied by school enrollment for the applicable program. And so once the school district total amount is determined, 75% per pupil, 75% of the per pupil funds allocated to a school district are supposed to go to the schools for whom these children are assigned, where these children attend, so that schools can be spending these funds directly on services and assistance for English learners. The way that the blueprint enforces that provision is by requiring, as part of this, that for local school systems to demonstrate that they have indeed allocated these funds to the school, at least 75% of that by school. The law stops there, though, right? The law does not go insofar as to say, well, once it's at the school building, we need to ensure that the funds are being spent on services and assistance for English learners. And there are lots of reasons why that sort of policy instrument is not or may not have been deployed here, right? First of all, Maryland school systems, on average, do not employ a site-based management model. So site-based management or school-based autonomy is a model wherein each school, typically a principal leader at that school, will have discretion not just over a small subset of discretionary resources, but the overall planning of the school staffing, of where their resources are going to go, which programs and services they're going to purchase, essentially, to support their students. In Maryland, currently, it's, I believe, only Prince George's County Public Schools and Baltimore City Public Schools deploy site-based autonomy or site-based management models. As a result of that, in most of our jurisdictions here, principals or school-level leaders, where 75% of these funds are going, don't have discretion over a lot of those resources. A lot of that actual planning goes to district-stipulated staffing models, for example, right? And in a state where 89% of our expenses at the district level go towards personnel costs, as you can imagine, that eats up a lot of those English learner funds. And so, absent provision of what these funds are supposed to be used on, or how those funds are to be allocated at the school level, ultimately could result, and it might not necessarily, but it could result in those funds going to other resources at the school. Because in the same way, the previous formula, funds would go to the local school system, and they would go into the school system pie, and they would cut those slices and give those out to different schools. That would be their funding allocation, right? Now what we're saying is the funding pie, it goes to the school level. So we are aggregating these funds as long as the school district can show that each school is receiving what they're supposed to receive. Once the dollars hit the school building, they roll up again to that level for the school to essentially deploy. Which leads us today to our activity, because understanding not just how these funds come to our school systems and our school buildings, but starting to grapple with the utility of these funds, and not just what can a school system do and how can they ensure that these funds go to support English learners, but also to start talking in real terms with the dollars that we're looking at in the blueprint formula, what those spending plans might look like, right? How much utility can come from the amount of funds that a school could receive through the blueprint formula weights for English learners. And so to do this activity, we're actually going to be, in just a moment, I'm going to be sharing a file. So I'm actually going to go ahead and start with that before I dive into this, because I want to make sure that this works. And we have a backup plan if for some reason this file drop doesn't work. So pardon me, everybody, while I share the file.
Justin, do we have a few minutes to look at some of the questions in the chat box?
Absolutely. Let me scroll up.
Question about if reclassified students are still an account for up to 2 years. For the funding count, my answer is no. Is that correct, Ilhe?
Yes, that's correct. Reclassified English learners are not included.
They're included in accountability. We certainly provide services for them in the form of monitoring, but not for funding. There are some good comments here. I hope you're all seeing them from our experts also. I'm looking to see if any more questions. Also a question about the count for how many times a year. It is done once a year, and actually the funding lags a year behind. So it does address, Anne Marie, your question about the fact that you get like every school system really does get a lot in January, a lot of new students. Those students will impact that count in the following year's funding picture. Am I missing any other questions? Because we're doing well with time.
If you do have any other questions, Zahava's with us until 4:30. So if you, not that Justin can also answer questions, but she could probably answer more national perspectives and such, just because she spends most of her day researching these things and trying to get states to be more progressive with their funding models and such. So do you have any questions related to anything while she's here? I think we have one. Anjali?
Yeah, the question, hi everyone, thank you so much for this. I was very impressed with the sort of the moonshot tier that you mentioned, and I noticed that you had the SLIF students, but what about funding pertaining to grade level, so sort of the differences between pre-K, elementary, middle, and high school? And I bring this up because for those of us who've supervised teachers at the elementary versus middle versus high school, there are also sort of funding expenses that are associated at these levels, particularly for ELs, that are particularly crucial. There is sort of a glut in the market in terms of an overproduction of elementary school teachers, but then not many expert high school teachers, or particularly in STEM areas and math areas and so on and so forth. So content expertise particularly as a factor in funding.
So I think to answer your question with a question, that depends on whether there are big differences in the proportion of high school students versus elementary students from district to district that are classified as English learners. Because this funding is provided at a per student level, if on the whole, different districts have similar proportions of students across grade levels with English learning needs, then that kind of differentiation is going to come out in the wash. Right? We're not going to see that, because it's not as though the money actually gets put in the student's pocket. Right? It is spent at the district or school level with the complexities that Justin was talking about earlier with school-based governance over budgeting, but it gets spent from a bigger pot, And given that, if you have similar, if a given district is going to have 7% or 17% or 70% of its students at roughly all grade levels that are eligible for English learner education, then those differences in funding are not going to impact the budget in a meaningful way. If, however, you see, for instance, we're having a big surge in elementary English learner enrollment specifically, or something of that nature, then it may be worth thinking about differentiating that way. So I think that may be a policy that's for targeting a time of change. But over time, generally speaking, those proportions are fairly constant across grade level in most places.
Thank you.
Connor?
Hey, thanks for coming. I'm not at all good at school funding formula. I'm really learning a lot and appreciating this. We heard earlier in sessions ago from Texas about something they're doing in funding that didn't show up in your recommendations. I just wanted to, one, surface it again, and two, ask if you know contextually of other states doing similar. It was called House Bill 3. It was a few years ago. They said that they are now using their state funding formula, waiting for ELs to nudge districts towards using more research-based dual language programs to support these kids. In essence, that you can gain additional state formula funding by putting or enrolling more ELs in dual language programs, given those seem to do better. In other words, right, they're gearing EL-weighted formula, EL formula weights to instructional model. Is any other state doing that? I'm not aware of one. I'm just wondering.
I'm not aware of one either. I will say the level of differentiation we're talking about there is not huge. So remember when I said that Maryland has one of the leading weights in the country? The base weight for English learners in Texas is 10%. And then any student enrolled in a dual language program, whether they are a student who is a native English speaker or a student who is an English learner, generates 5%. So if you're a native English speaker who's in a dual language program, it's 15%. If you are a native speaker of a different language enrolled in dual language, then your total English learner plus dual language weight will be 15%. I know I said that fast, but hopefully people followed it. That is a policy choice that I would be hesitant to recommend across the board. I think some of what I was saying earlier about linguistic diversity in some places and not others makes a default to dual language programs more challenging to implement. And I don't necessarily want to put places with significant linguistic diversity at a funding disadvantage. That said, if the work group has a very strong conviction about instructional models, that is certainly an available pathway. I would consider it a bonus weight and not a core funding element.
So just so I hear you, Zahava, and I see some other questions. So we know, like in the early grades, like dual language immersion works really well for EL kids, especially when you have the numbers. If you have the numbers, obviously, in a more, and so your recommendation would be based on what you would see is, have like the right weights and everything, silver, gold, etc. But if you want to nudge people to implement dual language schools, make that a bonus program or like a special grant incentive program to get people there versus folded in to the base and weight just for ELs as a requirement. At least that's what I'm hearing. Is that right?
I don't know that I explicitly object to it being a weight, but I think that keeping things in proportion and thinking, okay, we're not going to say, okay, instead of a single 85% weight, we want the core weight to be 50% and then another 35% if it's dual language. We want to keep things in proportion and understand that's not going to be feasible or advisable everywhere, and we shouldn't funnel too much of our English learner funding through a specific program targeted allocation. That would be my recommendation.
Got it. Drew?
Hi, everyone. First of all, Zahava and Jeffrey, thank you so much for doing this number crunching. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the reference to New Jersey, also my home state that you mentioned there. Zahava, for you, since you were looking at all of the states around the country and what they have been doing with funding, were you looking at any types of comparisons in their English learner percentage populations in there? Were you looking at the types of English learner populations that are in there in comparison with Maryland? Were you trying to look at what comparable states have been doing, or were you just looking all over the place just to see what everyone has been doing? this has been a discussion I know in many other committees and work groups I've been throughout the state and other entities, being able to look at comparable English learner populations as opposed to running and looking at California, for example, or looking at Texas. And this has just been a discussion overall. And I'm not saying one is right or wrong. I'm just curious, when you were looking at them, were you also looking specifically at their populations in comparison to what we currently have and what we are projecting to have in Maryland? Why or why not, when you're looking at their fundings?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I've done that I've narrowed the analysis specifically to states with comparable populations. I think what we do see is that policy does not tend to cluster in that way. So for instance, Texas and Georgia are both top 10 states for English learner enrollment as a percentage. Texas has one of the lowest rates in the country for English learners. Georgia has the highest. That it is not an automatic response. And sometimes you'll hear policymakers say, we have so many English learners, we need to economize and have a lower weight because we can't afford a higher weight for so many students. You'll have other policymakers say, this is a really growing central population in our state. And if we want to maintain our outcomes and competitiveness, we need a really robust weight. So I think the politics do not always align the policy with the level of need. That said, this isn't something that I've been very specific about in this analysis. What I'm giving you is a national landscape, but it's certainly something we can follow up with.
Looks like Libya. You're on muted.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I just want to do a quick follow-up on Drew's question on comparisons, because that triggered my thinking about any work you have done, Zahra, on or your organization on the comparison of actual outcomes then when you're looking at the different funding models, and how much analysis are we able to do looking across states on what happens to the students in terms of their ultimate achievement.
I always get a version of this question and I'm never able to give a satisfying answer, so I apologize in advance. There are so many mediating decisions between funding level and student outcomes that what I tend to say is funding is a necessary but insufficient condition for good student outcomes. So the first decision you have to make is making sure that the people on the ground, what one of my professors used to call the people who touch the little hands, that they have enough to work with. Having enough to work with does not guarantee producing those strong outcomes. They may funnel all of that money into methods that are not backed by research. They may funnel it into academics, but neglect the side of family engagement. There are ways that money can be used well and ways that money can be used less well. And obviously, how well matters at least as much as how much. So I can only say that a strong funding policy creates the baseline conditions within which good, responsible, committed decision makers can produce good outcomes with kids. But I cannot guarantee you that any individual funding model is going to lead to those outcomes.
Great. I think we'll stop there with questions so we can, because we really want you to dive into this activity. And the team worked really hard to design it. Essentially, you will be allocating funding. And so Justin, with that, Zahra, we want to thank you. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully I can invite you back because I would want to pick your brain as we go to our final reporting in December. So we really appreciate your time. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
With that, Justin, the floor is yours.
All right, and the question is actually a great segue onto this, because to Zahava's point there, right, it's not just about how much, right, that alone is insufficient. It's how and in what way resources are deployed, and that is the thrust of this activity. So I'm going to start by sharing a file. Go ahead and feel free to download it now. I mean, you're welcome to open it, but if you want to hold off a minute, you're more than welcome to. Just everybody give me 1 second to get this in here. Well, that is not at all how I expected that to look. It's not actually sharing. Okay, so my backup plan is going to go into effect here. I'm going to be dropping a link in just a moment where you all will be able to download this. So apologies on that one. I'm going to switch to doing a quick screen share instead. So pardon me, everybody, while I go ahead and drop that link instead. So if you would all give me about 30 more seconds to get you ready for this. All right, everyone, I have shared with you all a folder location. I'm going to drop the link here in the chat so you don't have to check your emails if you don't want to. Grab that link right now. All right, everyone. Everyone should now have received a link in the chat that'll take you to, I'm going to test it on my end. Perfect, okay. You can go to that one, or I would even recommend, if anybody would prefer, let me actually do this. Thank you all for your patience. Okay, all right. That link will take you to the folder because you'll want to download this file and not just view it in Google Sheets. So just a heads up, in case this automatically opens in Sheets for all of you, go ahead and download it. While you do that, though, I'm going to go over the activity. So, like we just said, it's not just about the amount of funding, it's also about how we deploy those funds. And so we are going to talk through a funding scenario here, where you will choose one of 3 schools available on the screen. My thanks, by the way, to one of our LEA members, Paula Moore, who's actually on the call with us as well, for helping think through some of this. And we actually added an extra school in part to talk through some of the diseconomies of scale that Zahra walked us through earlier. So I'm going to start on the school side. We're going to be looking at 3 schools here. School 1 is an elementary school. We have some contextual factors here on this screen. You'll want to reference back to the slide deck as we go, because while there's some information about the school, that being English learner enrollment in the file that we'll be looking at, these other contextual factors live here on this slide. With each of these, you'll see total enrollment. So again, school 1 is an elementary school. They have 348 children enrolled. 80% of the school's population is title eligible. I say that for context about depth of need and the broader student body at this particular school. Please note that as part of this exercise, we're looking only at state and local funds. We've excluded federal funds. So you're not looking at any Title III money or anything like that. We're just looking at state and local funds. This school has an EL enrollment of 187, and they have 23 native languages spoken at that school, 30% of which are Spanish speakers, 10% speak Vietnamese, 5% speak Amharic, and 5% speak Urdu. The remaining languages are less than 1% each. Their total school budget is about $5.5 million, but with the blueprint formula, they have $1.16 in funding specifically for English learners. School 2, high school. Larger school, 1,146, so it's a medium to large high school here in Maryland. 45% Title I eligible enrollment, so less or fewer students who are economically disadvantaged in attendance. Also a smaller English learner enrollment here. So we have 150 students who are enrolled at this school. 8 languages are spoken. 85% though of the English learners' home language is Spanish at the school. They have a total school budget of $12.8 million. Key to this exercise though, their English learner fund allocation is $934,000. So again, for this specific school, they have a slightly smaller English learner allocation because even though the school is larger and there are more students enrolled, they have fewer English learners enrolled at that school. Last title is our second elementary school for the activity. This one speaks to a school in Western Maryland with 363 students, 41% of which are Title I eligible. They have 11 students enrolled. 81% of the students, 9 students there speak Spanish, 1 student speaks Portuguese, 1 student speaks Farsi. That school budget is about $1.2 million, but they only received $91,000 in English learner funding with 11 students. So this school in particular, if you're looking for to deal with or plan with a budget speaking to sparsity, to diseconomies of scale, you'll want to select School 3 when we go into the tab here in a moment. Our cost assumptions. So this is how we have our school context for the schools that we're going to look at. But now we have to figure out what we're going to do with the funds. So again, once we open up these files and get going here in just a second, you'll be able to choose, again, just for the sake of this activity and for time, because we're going to want to come back together and talk through some of the findings and noticings that we've had with this activity. Please just pick one school. Once you've picked that school, you are going to go ahead and draft a spending plan for that school. So there are certain cost assumptions here to make that effort a little bit easier. You will be able to select the number of teachers, the number of FTE teachers that you can choose, whether or not that teacher is an ESOL teacher, bilingual teacher, dual language program, as part of a dual language program. You can decide when you're crafting your spending plan. But those costs there, just to be really clear, I know we see teacher and $105,000. That's including all fringe benefits, teacher retirement costs, pension, et cetera. Same thing for paraprofessional. 1.0 paraprofessional is $49,000. You'll see that in there. It's all built in. You don't have to remember any of this, and you don't have to write any of this down. It's all in the sheet that we'll look at. Textbooks, there's cost in there for any textbooks you might be using. Curriculum writing, that's at the rate of 1 teacher per day, and so depending on how many teachers you have involved or the length of time, how many days they might need for common planning time or planning with different grade levels, that per diem rate is structured into the sheet for you to populate. With supplies and materials and language learning software, there are drop downs so you can select within these ranges. And then in addition to that, we of course want to give you an option to identify some other parameters here. So in case there's something outside of what we've listed for this exercise, you have 2 opportunities to add those costs into your plan. One is a cost associated with anything district level. Let's say, for example, you want to plan for school-based cost of an EL coordinator that is at the district, and so you're covering a portion of the salary for an English learner coordinator. And then, of course, our catch-all, right? And each of these opportunities, when you look at the sheet, and we'll open it in a second, I'm actually going to go ahead and share a live version of the sheet here. You'll notice as you're in the sheet, you have your 3 schools on the bottom. So when you open the file, you can click between School 1, School 2, and School 3. I've also added the instructions here to lay out in additional detail what you're doing with this activity. So again, reference the PowerPoint for broader school context. And you're going to plan this out by first entering the quantity of an item in the blue cells. So you'll enter an item here. Let's say I want 5 teachers. You'll enter that here. Note when you do that, it'll tell you how much you've planned so far, both for teachers, but also across all of your planned spend. It'll also give you, in case you're trying to work toward a particular teacher to student ratio, it'll calculate that for you up top. So if you need to look at that, you can see that here. And you also get just a check on how much of the EL allocation per pupil you're allocating for personnel costs for non-personnel costs. As I noted, just a quick little nuance as you're navigating these bottom columns here. If you are choosing supplies and materials or language learning software, for example, I could say, let's say I'm getting all 187 students software here. I would just select the drop down and you can select one of the pricing options within the range that we mentioned in the cost assumption. Same thing with supplies and materials. And then with shared district costs and others, you are free to enter in values here as you see fit. Just make sure you enter into quantity there, even if it's just 1, so that it actually totals that for you. Last but not least, because we'd really love to get a sense of how you're thinking about this, what approach you're using, if you're basing this on a particular program design or program structure, throw in some information to the notes and justification field. You can also edit these. So these are the yellow highlighted cells on the right. You can type directly into them and go right from there. That'll give us some information and context as we come back together as a group to look at and talk through these plans. So As you go through, I'm going to give everybody here about 5 or so minutes just to work through, and then we'll bring it back as a group, and we'll talk through some of the decisions you've made, some of the trade-offs you've considered, and I'm curious to see how far this funding gets you, if it gets you to the program goals that you want to lay out, if there are other areas that you would like to see more of. In either case, hopefully this will feed an interesting conversation about deploying these funds with the current EL weights that we have here in Maryland. So if you have any problems accessing this file or the folder, I would say throw it into the chat and I'll reach back out to you. I've got that up here. We'll look there. Just the FY formula that we're using for this is FY23. So these are draft preliminary FY23 formula amounts.
Any questions as you guys jump into this? We'll give you about 10 minutes so we can have 10 minutes of discussion as well, but we really wanted to get time. But it looks like I see a couple of hands up, so I want to make sure that wasn't just you accidentally pressed the hand up button. But if you have a question, please just go ahead and shoot right now. Just unmute and let Justin know. Okay, why don't we take 10 minutes for you to build out a funding model for the school that you are choosing, and then we'll regroup at around 4:50. So sounds good.
Everyone, I've placed the school context slide back up on the screen in case that's helpful for the activity. Just wanted to give everybody a 2-minute warning here. We've got about 2 minutes.
All right.
4:50, everybody. It is that time.
And it's okay, obviously, if you couldn't get to everything you wanted to get to. I think it's about, we wanted to just have a conversation about the tension of ideas of when doing an exercise like this. And frankly, we should have everyone in Annapolis do this exercise when they set funding. So I think it's just worth going through the exercise and hearing what went into your decision making, and it will help us further refine this exercise, because we want to do more broader work with our community around just funding and just what that looks at. You heard today from a group about just what is adequate or what is considered adequate to pull off the educational outcomes we want to see. So with that, Justin, why don't you facilitate the conversation?
That's right. So I'd love to start with if there's anybody who would be interested in actually sharing theirs and talking us through some of their decisions and justifications. I know Connor just dropped some information in chat. So Connor, I don't know if you want to volunteer first or not, but.
Sure, man, I'll take a crack at it. I need the common caveat across the entire group that I was a former first grade teacher and now I do policy research. And so I'm just guessing on a bunch of this stuff. These are things that happened to me in the classroom and now I don't immediately touch. So let me see if I can share my screen. It looks like I should be able to. Oh no, that would push you off, Justin. Never mind, whatever. Okay, so I did school.
No, you're okay, Connor. Go for it. I took it off. You're good.
Even cooler. So I did. No, it's all within Chrome. I'm gonna have to do that differently. I did school one, and my theory of this was that it was the one I was the closest to having expertise on, and so it's elementary school with a relatively high percentage of ELs. Can somebody just verbally let me know if they can see my Excel sheet here?
We see it.
Ah, word. Okay, great. So I even wrote relatively thorough justification. My theory of this was, as somebody who visits schools and talks to people who work with ELs, is that we almost always, I've never met an ESL teacher who said, man, I have just the right amount of students, or I have not enough students. Everybody's always overburdened. And the numbers you hear are ridiculous. I'm dealing with 110 students and it's just me, or, something like that. So I thought, okay, so priority number one was to ensure we had sufficient FTE of teachers to actually have a reasonable caseload or a student load for your ESL or bilingual teachers. And again, there's sort of some assumptions built in there too, right? Like this looks a lot different, I think, if we're thinking about bilingual teachers in classrooms versus ESL teachers who maybe push in, pull out, but nonetheless. So I went big on that. I spent, the overwhelming majority of the money here on, of the funding here on 8 FTEs for teachers, augmenting that with paraprofessionals. And again, I was investing heavily in personnel here with the theory that, and I'll get more into this in a minute, most of these subsequent lines I think are less impactful. Also, I think there's a real problem here to say, be honest, but given the overwhelming monolingualism of the US teaching force, the paraprofessionals are disproportionately where we're going to be able to support EL's bilingualism. So I'm assuming that we can find at least a handful of paraprofessionals within those 6, maybe most of them, with some ability to use students' home languages and support that, even if not in a fully programmatic way. Beyond that, and this is, again, you just have to forgive me that this is not things I know. I took a wild guess and said, well, we should have more than one textbook, at least one textbook per kid. And who knows? Maybe I'm wrong on that. Curriculum writing, I don't know if 30 days is even close to enough, but I decided to take a shot there, guessing on supplies and materials as well. The only other thing I have to add that's useful, I think, is that I don't believe yet that we have ed tech that is sufficiently valuable for language acquisition for ELs that we actually must have it for instructional purposes. I have seen it used effectively to foster or facilitate small groups, though. So if you have a few kids on, I won't name a software, on software X over here that's supposedly helping them acquire English or develop their bilingualism, that gives the teacher, the ESL teacher, then the ability to work with 5 students who all have a common need or some similar needs, something like that. So that was how I went through it. And then the district costs, I just rounded out whatever dollars I had left. So again, forgive me if I've made horrible assumptions in there, but the big things I would lean on heavily are that obviously we should be investing heavily in keeping ratios down so that teachers can really focus on specific needs kids have. And it's the same use of ed tech there too. Try to target specific data-driven, oftentimes homogeneous groupings to bring kids along.
Great. Thank you for going first. And I really appreciate hearing your thinking. Who would like to go next? Or who can the state superintendent call on next?
Special nudge for anybody who did school 2 or school 3.
All right, Libya, you want to go?
I did not follow instructions. I'm very sorry. I had my digital challenges here, and I just a few minutes ago got the email from you. But just very quickly, so I just kind of made it up looking at the data from school 3 profile. And to Connor's point, there was such a limited budget there. But having been a former school leader and also a district leader, my immediate thinking was there's no way you can use only the EL allocated budget to support the needs of all the, even though it's a small group of kids. So my first priority was to make sure we spend and invest the funds in a professional, well-qualified, trained ESOL bilingual teacher. And my thinking on that is for building capacity. What if we have more than 11 kids in that school? And I would make up the difference with the general school budget. And almost everything else falls into place because communication, translation, engagement, materials, digital, and I don't know about textbooks. I'm really not a big textbook advocate, especially for EL students. Those should all come under general funds because that's a requirement for everybody. I don't see the need to limit the expenditure only with limited EL funds. And by the way, I note that the school qualified for Title III as well. So there's other funding sources, and I would emphasize partnerships and resources with the community. I'm assuming there's a very small population, but even getting volunteers, and this could be another way of getting family and community engagement. I would do a lot of partnering, buddy up with community leaders that would be helpful with like Farsi or some of other languages other than Spanish. So that was my general thinking, but I don't even know if I followed the activity appropriately. Sorry, Justin, because I didn't get to see all the
That's really helpful to know. I mean, because general other dollars, there's a lot of intersectionality as well. You can have an English language learner who's also Title I, special education, there's general dollars, right? So it all makes
Exactly.
sense.
So
Yeah,
my main point was just that, Mohammed, is that we, as a leader, you would want to think about all resources, not just that one categorical funding stream, which is for some people is a good excuse, like we can't do anything. But I think we have to think more broadly and think that our EL multilingual learners are just as entitled, and the family, to all the other resources. And by the way, there was a lot of talk about translation rights and responsibility. Well, that is a civil rights requirement. And it doesn't say that it comes out of EL funds. That is general funds. So I would look at how we mix and match and different funding streams in a very different way, because it's how we prioritize more systemically and holistically.
That's great. Anne Marie?
Thank you, Libby. I appreciate that perspective. Another thing that I would want to consider for that school, though, is that if there's only 11 students in the building, they may be spread across 6 grade levels. And so there's going to have to be a lot of allocation for lesson study or curriculum study for that L teacher to be able to support classroom instruction, and by default kind of becoming a coach, because she can't be or he can't be everywhere at all times, to be able to raise capacity within the building. So even looking at what their responsibilities would be, but looking at what you were saying, Libya, you could also use that funding. You could also get funding from other sources for that person to also be a coach within the school.
Great. Drew, I see your hand up.
The only thing I really want to add to this is looking at the other category. I'm looking at the various linguistic and cultural backgrounds of the students in these 3 groups. I really think it's important to invest in some sort of or multiple types of liaisons with the communities, particularly with the non-majority language or the non-majority culture that is in the schools. So moving away from more of the Spanish, for example, Spanish Salvadorian groups, which tend to be more dominant in many of our schools, where the teachers might have somewhat of a knowledge. We might have more paraprofessionals who have knowledge of that, and moving towards more of the other languages like Urdu, Haitian Creole, the ones that are now beginning to come about in the schools that people will have less access to, less knowledge with. It might be more difficult to get paraprofessionals immediately who are familiar with that. I would take a look more at that other funding to see how can we start bringing community liaisons who can work with the teachers, who can work with the paraprofessionals who might not be as engaged with that. So that's something I was looking at with all 3 schools, was what is this extra funding, or where can I take funding away from other sources to go towards those community liaisons to really help the school understand and engage with the non-dominant English learners. And we have to take into account that population trends are switching constantly in the state of Maryland. It's no longer just concentrated in Baltimore and the DC metro area. People are moving out, and people are not realizing how to engage with these new English learner groups. And as was mentioned earlier, we're now getting more refugees from different areas that just a short while ago we weren't even considering. And this is something that we have to have, and we don't have the resources. We don't necessarily have the paras, and we definitely don't have the teachers who have the know-how of how to work with them. And this is how to introduce that concept as well.
Thank you. Diego, I think your hand is up.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm a former ESL student, and I can attest to the fact that teachers get overwhelmed by the fact that there's many students in the single classroom. It's really hard. I was doing obviously the math in the school one. I wanted to do like around 15 students per teacher. And then my numbers weren't right already. I was like, whoa. Right. So I went back a little bit for 8. So that would be $840,000 a year. And the math is like 23 students per teacher. So that would go back and it would still be the same story. You know, teachers get overwhelmed. A lot of people don't get attention. Teachers have to do, you know, the extra mile to teach as well, which is really hard to do. So yeah, I don't want to repeat myself. You guys have been talking about this, you know, but I believe that it's definitely a problem, that the fact that there's many, and plus the influx of immigrants and refugees, asylum seekers, that's going to be coming in the next months. It's going to be hard for teachers to keep up the pace, I would say, and that's my opinion.
Thank you, Diego. We really appreciate it. I was like, when am I going to hear Diego talk one day? And I was like, Diego's talking right now. It's like he's a man of a few words, but when he does say something, listen up. So I really appreciate your commentary on that. And so what I am hearing, you know, personnel is definitely no surprise, the thing that rises to the top. Justin, what percentage of our dollars go to personnel in Maryland again?
89%.
89%. So, I mean, and then, you know, and even then, different programs feel like they don't have enough personnel or qualified personnel or the relevant personnel, whether that be bilingual or who serve in different capacities. So, with that, guys, we are over time. I hope this exercise was fun. We're going to continue school finance for one more session. We're going to talk about Title III, and we'll have another guest speaker. Obviously, our work group site, please steer people there if they want to learn about what is going on. You can find our agenda there, our anything that we have done, the recorded session, it's all there. And then finally, the State Department of Education is, again, going through a massive restructuring as well. So we're in strategic planning mode. So please let people know about our survey. We really want to get a lot of people applying, submitting their responses to this. So really appreciate you guys pushing it through. So we will see you at the next session. Thank you so much. As usual, it's a major time commitment, but has major implications. So really, really grateful.